Welcome back, everybody. Today I'm joined by a returning guest to the program. It's Comrade Carlos Garrido of Midwestern Marx and the still relatively new American Communist Party, who's joining us today, as the title of the video suggests, to talk about the ACP, its foundation, but also the how that relates to the real life of the American worker in this period of decaying imperialism. So very happy to have him back on the show, and so I welcome back Carlos. Good to have you with us.
Thank you for having me on, comrade. It's the third time we get to speak, and the other two have been very delightful conversations. Your show is one of my favorite on YouTube, so it's a real pleasure to be here.
Well, good to have you here at a time when I think I was discussing this with another guest yesterday, Kit Clarenberg, whose work you might be familiar with, a journalist for the Grey Zone, a British exile living in Serbia, who we were discussing like how empires fall apart, basically, how imperialism, particularly imperialism in its crisis moment. And I wanted to talk to you about this today in reference to particularly the life of the working class in the imperial core countries. Obviously, the United States ruling class took on the mantle of leadership of an entire imperialist bloc after 1945 and has led it since then. Now it's facing, I would call it, a endpoint crisis, where it has multiple challenges that externally it cannot really overcome. And those challenges and weaknesses of imperialism are going to being revealed all the time, whether it's by Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran, or whether it's by the US imperialism and British imperialism's inability to deal with the rise of Chinese industrial and scientific power, or Russian military power in Ukraine. We are in an all fronts crisis of imperialism. But this relates then back to the internal question inside the United States, which is that life for the American worker, for the domestic American working class, has been portrayed by US propagandists for a long time as being the ultimate reason why socialism isn't required. This was always the argument in the Cold War. The American worker they all live in detached houses with a garage, two cars, and their life have a life that most of the world could barely even dream of. That is, even to my limited knowledge, having not set foot in your country for a long time, but even just reading about it in academic studies and through looking at even American government statistics, life for the American worker in this long downward swing period of imperialism is getting harder. It is getting more brutish, and the expectations of life that the American worker has are being more cruelly dashed in every successive generation since the 1970s. So, given that situation and facing this crisis, you would have think that U.S. imperialism's strategists would come up with something to try and do something to address this decline. But it seems that they are unable to. They're unable to offer any real reform to the domestic working class. What they've done is they've provided a political theater of the absurd in terms of the Trump-Harris presidential race, revealing so much about what the presidential office actually means under imperialism, and perhaps we can discuss that later. But they offer no reform, they offer no way forward, they offer no hope at all to the American worker that anything will get any better. So, given all of that, like the urgency for a return of real class politics in the United States is more actually vital than ever, given that the future under decaying imperialism only leads to real life slow death by despair. So I wanted to get your take on like what the life of the real conditions of the American worker right now in the United States, and the inability of the ruling class to even pretend to address this.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the absolute head in terms of the conditions that we have here in the US. We had a period of time in the 20th century, and we cannot lie about this, where there was the ability to accumulate in sectors of the working class. There was periods of serious financial stability. It was called the golden era of American capitalism, where at least in the white part of the working class, their experience was elevated to one of what Engels would have called the bourgeoisified middle class, with
Hmm.
stability, with two automobiles, the two kids, two and a half dogs, or something like that, the white picket fence, the American dream. And this was a dream that was a part of a very limited section of the working class. The black part of the working class wasn't a participant in this dream. In fact, for most of the history of this dream, the black part of the working class lived under conditions virtually of apartheid up until 1964. What has happened since the 70s is that that condition that was developed out of a few factors, strong labor movement backed up by a communist party, the fact that we were the imperial core, we still are, but the super profits, super exploitation that we did of the global south allowed for crumbs to be given to parts of the working class. And you also had a strong alternative paradigm in the existence of the Soviet Union. Those are three central factors upon which the reality of that stability is based. What has happened to those factors? Well, the unions have been utterly destroyed. The communist parties have been destroyed, not just through repression, but through the promotion of this thing that calls itself the left. That it's as left as a chicken with a duck bill calling itself a duck. It's not left at all. It's created by the institutions of the State Department, of the CIA, etc., by the Congress for Cultural Freedom. It's focused on cultural issues, on issues of social morality, and other affairs. It's dominated in terms of worldview by what I've called the purity fetish, and in terms of class position by the professional managerial stratum. A stratum that is relatively comfortable in their day-to-day life. You had, of course, the counter-revolution in the Soviet Union that kind of shot down that alternative paradigm that was readily visible. And so this creates the conditions around the 1970s for a turn towards more austerity and towards the process that we have called, following Noah Krashevik at the Institute, reproletarianization, where that sector of the American working class that bourgeoisified itself has been periodically reproletarianized. Now, instead of their lives being dominated by stability and the ability to accumulate, the ability to go out twice for dinner every week and have a few vacations, now instead of that, they have what every basically every American experiences, which is drowning in debt, difficulties figuring out how to make ends meet. I mean, 80% of the American public is living paycheck to paycheck. That means they're one paycheck away from being thrown into the streets with the 650,000 homeless people living in a country with 33 times as many empty homes as homeless people. On top of that, they've seen other forms of cultural crises arise, the rise of addiction and crime, and a whole host of other things that make life unbearable. So, all in all, what existed of that middle class has died. It has been reproletarianized, and the lives of the American people today are plagued by poverty, by instability, by debt, and by general desperation. And it's been that destruction of that material base of stability that has, at the level of the thoughts that people have, at the ideological level, accounted for the crisis of legitimacy that we have in our country. The fact that today only 19% of the American people actually feel like their representatives represent them is a historic fact. I can't pinpoint any other period in American history where that has been the case. The fact that only 11% of the American public actually believes in what the mainstream media says. It's a historic fact. What we have in our hands is a crisis of legitimacy. The way the world has worked is no longer working for American working people, and now they're conscious of it. They don't want to keep on going on in the old way. And given the crisis of imperialism that we have, even the ruling class itself cannot continue to go on in the old way. And as good Leninists, we know what that means when neither the working people nor the ruling class can continue to go on in the old way. One of the interesting things that happens in 2016 is that you have the development of the MAGA movement where Trump, through this populist rhetoric of ending the wars, bringing back the jobs, at some point he was even arguing for a sort of universal health care. He's able to win a significant part of that disaffected working class base that historically voted for Democrats. In most counties in the Midwest, for instance, the people that voted for Trump were Obama, and then Trump. So that's something that's left off of the discussion. These people are just painted by the liberals as a basket of racist deplorables. But one of the things that Trump suggested that really got a lot of their ears was bringing manufacturing, blue-collar jobs back. He, of course, did not do that, just like he didn't end the wars or do anything else he promised as a good politician. It's almost illegal if a politician, within the context of capitalism, fulfills the things he promises. It's like, it's very bad form for them to do that. But for the American people, that was an exciting paradigm. The ability to have the jobs that provided their parents or their grandparents the stability that they were raised listening to. The problem is that, capitalism is a system that has certain laws that we have to study. Hegel was the one following Spinoza, and this is taken up by Marxism as well, that argued that freedom is the recognition of necessity. In a social context, that means that we have to understand, to be truly free, the necessity of the social laws that are driving forth capitalist development. That's the only way we can intervene in either changing them or destroying them or deviating them from their course as best as possible, riding the tiger as China has kind of done. What we have to realize is that in the context of the U.S., and I would say to a lesser but still true extent in Britain and in other parts of Europe, the fleeing of productive capital abroad is not something that could be undone within the confines of the capitalist mode of life, because there was a necessity behind that fleeing. There was a deep period of crisis that people are perhaps too young or too unread to remember in the 70s that led to capital needing to go abroad in order to find cheaper variable capital, cheaper labor power for the capitalists to buy and therefore increase their rate of profit. So that cannot be undone within the confines of a society that produces for the sake of profit and capital accumulation and not for the sake of meeting human needs. So we have this crisis in our hands where the working class is rocking the boat ideologically. They're no longer believing the ideas of the past. And unlike in previous eras, it's generalized across the whole working population, and it cannot be undone. Because in previous areas, you can have sort of FDR-like programs of, public works or, promote the productive economy through other means. But today, that's virtually impossible. It would go against the logic of the system itself. So it's a very interesting time to be a communist in the U.S. And I think this is what creates the context or the need for an organization such as the ACP.
Well, yes. I mean, what you said there reminded me of actually, we just had our national budget for the year done this week by our rather pretentiously titled finance minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. But what reading, I was doing a live stream on that, we're going through it. And what occurred to me was that essentially for all that they denounced Trump, they're all trying the same things he did, which is by trying to essentially bribe capital to invest. Because that's what they're doing here. They're talking about, oh, we're going to build renewable energy. How are you going to do it? Well, we're going to have an energy company that isn't actually an energy company. It's a clearinghouse for money. It's a means by which money goes through, out of the government, through this company, to private companies to try and throw state subsidies at them to encourage them to invest in what they refer to as green energy, and also to do the manufacturing of the relevant parts here in Britain. But of course, they're not interested in doing that. They're not. And then what they're going to do is they're going to do exactly what they've done before, which is take the money and then say, can we have some more? And the state will pay them again, hoping that they'll invest something. Because the rate of profit for investing in Britain is too low, and it's been too low for at least 60 years. You can make an argument, in actual fact, that it probably started in the 1860s in terms of the deindustrialization, because British manufacturing stopped reinvesting in a lot of industries after really the 1850s. And as some American writers have observed, in terms of production of means of production, American capitalism outstripped British capitalism by the 1850s in many areas, especially in sort of production line technology. And so the British capitalists, rather than invest in new means of production, sent the money to the colonies. They sent the money to certain parts of India, to certain parts of so the African nations, rather than reinvest at home. So what you say there is completely correct. You can't turn that around. Whether you're Donald Trump and you're calling it MAGA, or whether you're Keir Starmer and you're calling it, what is it? You referred to it as social democracy for the 21st century, or whatever the fuck awful shit he's going on about this week. And that you most of the so-called left in Britain, looking at that budget, just said, oh well, he should have gone further, but it's all right, really. That's like most of the sort of Labour Party people. But there's no understanding of the fact that it's not a reversible process, what's gone on. The car industry under capitalism isn't going to come back, no matter how much. The only thing you're going to get is, and this is an experiment they're trying here now, which is we've actually got special economic zones in Britain now, which are being turned into supposedly deregulatory paradises. So that's their solution here. I'm pretty sure that with the way that the U.S. capitalism is organized, or what they seem to be doing there is shoving like car plants into deep South states, which are actively anti-union, and you seem to be going through a similar process there, which is that the ruling class, it knows it's got to do something, but its only solution is, well, we've got to reduce the American worker to the same condition that we would find in Indonesia or Thailand or Cambodia. And so we've got to make it, if we're going to do anything, it's going to be non-union. We're going to get the states and the federal government to back us up on this. And we're going to have it done by the most hyper-exploitable layer of the population we can possibly find. So in my view, the only way that Britain or the United States gets back any manufacturing is if they actually make life for the worker far worse in terms of driving down wages, because that's the only way this is going to be profitable. And that's, of course, Trump, I don't think understands that. I think some American capitalists are cynical enough to understand it, but most of the politicians aren't. But again, without a Marxist understanding of this, you as a leftist will just be led into taking all kinds of like contradictory stances that make no sense, because fundamentally the process cannot be reversed here. And as Lenin observed, this is part and parcel of imperialism. So before we could even get to the point where we could rebuild this country, or you could rebuild the United States, U.S. manufacturing, the current ruling class would have to be pushed aside. Yeah, you can't reform that. You can't have any kind of reform process anymore, because that period's just completely disappeared. And so the reality of another Trump term, from outside that looks like it's what it's going to be, is that the policies will evolve towards an even more relentless war on the American worker, and to drive wages down to the point where the American ruling class is prepared to invest again. I mean, that's my read on your situation, because it seems fairly similar to ours.
Yeah, I mean, what you mentioned about the car manufacturing industry, I mean, I think it's the only serious productive industry that hasn't taken that big of a hit. I mean, we're actually producing, I think, 10 times more cars now than we were, I think, in the 1970s, is the statistic that I recently saw. But I mean, they're trying to basically accomplish within the nation what the export of capital in search of cheaper raw materials and in search of cheaper labor accomplished since the 1970s, by taking it to the U.S. South and doing non-union jobs, as you mentioned. And I think part of the reason why that industry hasn't exported in the way that others have is, frankly, because of its sign value. Like, people like in America, they like feeling like they have an American automobile. And if they knew that automobile wasn't made in America, it would hurt the sign value, the prestige that's behind the commodity that they're buying, and that has made itself, perhaps artificially, an indispensable instrument for modern life, at least in the U.S., because we don't have public transport unless you want to get stabbed in, in in New York subways or something. So
Mm.
we have to realize, and this is something that people usually just read volume one of Capital. They don't read all the way through, but Marx talks about this in volume three. Capital, as it develops, is going to develop into higher and higher levels of abstraction and
Mm.
financialization. And people tend to see the process of financialization that we've seen in the West as some sort of break. But in reality, it's a firm continuity with the logic of capital. I mean, today we have a situation in the U.S. where like the largest 500 companies, most of their profits and most of the areas that their capital is being reinvested in, which is what capital has to do in order to be capital, has to be reinvested in capital accumulation. What sectors are they going towards? They're going towards rents, interest rates, and stock buybacks. So as parasitic as you can
Mm.
possibly get. It's quite literally in most instances making money from money itself, and
Yeah.
as a logical development of the capitalist mode of production, what that produces at the level of individuals is a keen awareness of the heightening of these contradictions. These people are literally getting rich without producing anything. There's not
Mm.
there's We have cities collapsing all around us, but somehow these parasites continue to grow bigger and bigger and bigger while all of our lives continue to fall into misery and indebtedness. And that's part of the natural tendency, the part of the lawfulness of the social development of capitalism, and it cannot be undone unless the social order itself is radically transformed and the working class comes into a position of political power.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the financialization being there from baked into the capitalist cake, so to speak. I mean, as you say, Marx talks about that, and Engels elaborates on it first in volume two and then volume three of Capital,
Yep.
where he says that the circuit goes from money, commodity to the capitalist trying to cut out the commodity part and just
Yep.
going from money to money. And the remarkable thing, I mean, when I read that for the first time and actually understood it, I was like, that was an incredible revelation to me, because that's exactly the process in Britain. It's like first send production overseas, then stop investing in production almost entirely. Just move the money around and come up with a profit at the end of it. So it's
Mhm.
exactly the process that was gone through. And the tragic thing was that, and here we'll get into talking about the failures of the previous generation of communist parties, that our communist party, as was, but CPGB as it was once called, didn't appear to have actually absorbed that point, which is such a crucial point in terms of understanding how capitalism goes. If you read that and then you read Lenin's imperialism to take those conclusions that Marx had brought together in the three volumes of Capital and apply it to the system that grew from the 1860s onwards, the imperialist system, the modern imperialist system, then you would understand that manufacturing under capitalism was doomed. But in our case, because the old Communist Party had attached itself monomaniacally to the idea of social democracy and the
Mhm.
idea that their role was to not work patiently for the point where the social democratic settlement would break down, but to defend it at all costs, even when the working class was open to more revolutionary outcomes, more revolutionary solutions. And so they defended it and defended it and defended it until they withered away, or they lost all of their working class cadre and just became basically a bunch of academics and trade union officials frantically defending the Labour Party at all costs. And that comes, I think, partially from a massive theoretical failure, a failure to understand that you cannot restrain the motion of capital with laws, with social democracy, with even like militant stances of workers in struggle to defend what they've got. As Marx observes in a book I'm reading with the study group at the moment, Value, Price and Profit, he observes in there that most working class struggles are defensive, and they're going to lead ultimately either to defeat or a very temporary victory,
Mhm.
because that is the nature of the system we live under. The capitalists are obliged by the very fact of their class position to continually attack. They don't have a choice. That's their system, and the worker is obliged to struggle. But the communist is obliged to step in and point to the worker that not only needn't you be in a world of perpetual struggle for very little benefit or marginal benefit, but also that the natural place for the worker is to become the ruler, to become the ruler of society at large. And I think that so many communist parties in the imperial core completely lost sight of all of that after 1945 and never recovered, which leads us to, of course, the discussion of the founding of the ACP and the necessity of that, because your own former communist party, the CPUSA, had completely gone off the rails, probably for about as long as ours had, and had given up on all of that and become an appendage of the Democratic Party. Now, you and other comrades were involved in a struggle inside of the old CPUSA to try and break it away from the Democrats. That ultimately was undemocratically destroyed by genocide Joe Sims, I think his name is, in his fanatical defense of Joe Biden at all costs. And of course, the ACP partially grows out of that struggle. Now, you've just had recently the first Congress of the ACP. It's attracting a lot of interest and a lot of genuine excitement, it seems, from people who've gone through this painful process of learning over the last few years, especially people in like their 20s, 30s, early 40s who've been through all these disappointments and have come out ready to actually look at, well, what does being a communist actually mean again? So now you're into this process a few months down the line, given what we've just been discussing in the foreground of this back and forth we've been having. How do you feel about the foundation of the party after the first Congress? What is your reflection on how things are going and the opportunities that this is actually opening up for communists in the United States now?
Yeah, that's a great question. And just to be clear, it was a convention. Our first Congress will be in 2026.
Okay.
It's where we were able to ratify our party's program and the Constitution. And then in due time, we'll be able to have elections for a central committee, which will then, in the Congress in 2026, postulate the series of goals for the party for the next period. But so how do I feel about the ACP in terms of its relationship to our context? I feel it's indispensable. We are working within one of the things that the old left did, if you can even call it left, was that they would create alternative communities of like leftists and then try to almost like invade working class communities with those communities. And if those communities did not live up to the expectation of the leftist communities, they would be condemned. We are taking a different approach. We are recognizing the fact that there's already communities there. And if we're ever going to win anyone, instead of sort of coming in from outside, we have to work from the communities that we're already a part of. The shop floors that we're a part of, the actual civil society institutions that we participate in. And one of the main focuses of the party in these last few months, and will continue, of course, to be one of the main focus, is winning the people through deeds. We have this sort of idea that, the way we are going to win the general public and the working class is simply through convincing them, through having the best arguments. And the reality is good arguments are good. They play a role when you're speaking to people. But I think most people are convinced by deeds. When they see that the communities they live in are filled with hazardous waste, with garbage, and then here come the communists, they clean it for no charge. And if you talk to them, they're normal people. They're not blue-haired leftists telling you to abolish the family and criticizing you for having more than 2 kids or something because the planet is going to explode if we have babies or something. So it's, I think through serving our communities, we prove indeed what communism is all about. And in a country that has been so steeped into McCarthyite fears and paranoia, we show people what we are through our actions. And then when they talk to us, I think that the way of us presenting communism is infinitely more effective than any of the groups that have came before us in the recent past. I mean, the way that we present it here in the US is in a way that is rooted in our understanding of the common sense that the American people are operating with, what Gramsci called their spontaneous philosophies. Of course, they're incoherent. The society they live in is incoherent and irrational. But there's common sense, rational kernels there. And it's our job to tease those out. And every American worker believes in the vision of democracy as a government or a society of, by, and for the people. And there's nothing easier than letting them know that the society we have today is government of, by, and for big capital, for big corporations, investment firms, and big banks, for the military industrial complex, and for the politicians in whose pockets all of these major corporations are in. In fact, sometimes we don't even have to tell them. Most of them already know this. But we do have to tell them, and this is where both the establishment and the so-called leftists produced by that establishment lie, is that that vision that they have for what America could be, the words uttered by Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address, government of, by, and for the people, that's socialism. When you have a society that works for working class people, for the vast majority of the society, that is not a capitalist society, because the interest that reigns supreme is not that of capital accumulation. What makes capitalism, in part, there's obviously a lot of components, but the central component is that what comes to reign supreme in every aspect of society, in every calculation, is the need for the accumulation of capital. If the society that you're going to be governing has as the basis of its most essential need the people, the satisfaction of the needs of the working class, the elevation of their living standards, and if the people doing all of that are working people, in my view, that's socialism. That's the essence of socialism. We can talk back and forth about various other terms that we can classify that as, but when I present socialism as that vision that the American people already accept, it is much more efficient. And then if they ask about, what's dictatorship of the proletariat, I explain that. But I think that we're in a context where what we have to do is show indeed what communists are actually about, connect communism to a vision that at least in part already exists embryonically in the common sense of the American public, and then do other things on that basis. Once we're embedded in communities, once we have won the trust of the people, and this is another thing, like leftists treat socialist communist organizing as if the goal is to make every person a Communist Party member. That's not the assumption that we're operating with. Yes, the advanced detachment will join the party. And one of the things that separates us from other organizations is that, according to our director of personnel, Kyle Perez, anywhere from 70 to 80% of our members are blue-collar workers. I had a meeting the other day with chapter executives. 3 of them were wearing, 2 of them were wearing miner's hat. 1 of them was wearing a rail hat because they stepped to the side from work. They took a break in order to join the meeting. I mean, I challenge you, find one organization in the U.S. left that has ever had that class basis in the last 40, 50 years. It's impossible to find. So one of the things that we're trying to do is integrate ourselves into these already existing communities, show people that, this was the point that I was going to make. Not everyone has to be a part of the party. I mean, the party also needs a sort of sympathetic mass that maybe doesn't even understand what communism is, but that just knows that the communists are the people that bring home the results. And that's part of what we're trying to build, that dual process of developing a hardened cadre of honorable, high caliber people, but also winning the trust of the communities that in due time, 2-3 years from now, when we're running in municipal elections or local elections, we'll realize, okay, I have these options. I have the red exploiter, the blue exploiter, I have the communists that have been serving my communities for all these years, that have developed sort of small communist enterprises in my communities that are actually enjoyable and that are not the same reproduced cosmopolitan businesses we see in every corner of the country, and that have actually put forth a program that represents me, is rooted in the needs that they know that I have because of these interactions, and that will serve those needs. So that's the 3-pronged strategy that we have been working with. Integrate ourselves into communities through community service, which also means integrate ourselves into unions and the working class struggle. Develop communist enterprises, which is a very heterodox part of our party. We've gotten a lot of flack online for it from leftists, but to do anything in the capitalist West, you need to have capital, you know? And we think that when we create the situation where chapters are able to have members come together and pool their resources and think creatively about what sort of enterprise they can create to serve the needs of their community and develop their own capital to do community service and do all these other things, we think that that has a dual effect that allows us to survive in terms of having the capital necessary to operate, which every organization needs, irrespective of its political character. But it also shows to the American public that this myth that they have been told about communists as the people that are coming in and just abolishing the small things that they own, taking away their small businesses, that has no bearing with reality, at least not in the communism of the 21st century. And the last component is on that whole basis, the enterprise, the community service, running political campaigns, not for the sake, as some other leftist organizations do, of losing but getting seen, but for the sake of actually winning local elections, showing that we can, at least in one area, one domain, win over the people, and with the resources of that domain, serve them in ways that are efficient. And if we can't do that and do so successfully, then maybe we don't deserve to be in power. If we can't win over a municipality and serve it and make the people happy, what right do we have to claim for ourselves the right to run the country? So that's sort of the results-oriented basis of our organization, and how I think we can provide something useful for the class struggle in America.
Well, the ruling class in the United States certainly understood the value of ejecting communists from the working class, which is what the House Un-American Activities Committee was really all about. Before we even get to like the Hollywood trials and Joseph McCarthy's prominence, it was about expelling worker militants from the unions and the industries themselves in the mid to later 1940s. So the ruling class understands that very well. That if they have to put up with the left being in place, then it will be one that is not a part of the working class at all.
Mm-hmm.
That it will be one that is separated from it. And unfortunately, they did manage to do that in the United States in the 40s. They did manage to destroy the communist presence in the unions largely, with some assistance from our old friends in the Trotskyites, but that's another story. But they put a great deal of value on achieving that because they understood, and their strategists understood. People like James Burnham, in fact, another former Trotskyite, did know very well that the strength of the communist movement lies in its interrelatedness and embeddedness within the working class. And if you remove that, then the communist, is the head of a spear without the rest of the spear behind it. Just a spear point means nothing. Without the rest of the class behind it, the vanguard is adrift, and that's the process that started to happen, I think, in many countries, but especially where the counter-revolutionary repression was very great inside the US after World War II, because they were desperate to clamp down and retain their very firm control over what was the homeland for the international imperialist system there back then and now. So the idea of actually going to the masses and to get a bit Maoist about it for a second, be among them and learn from them, is something that, as you say, most of the left in the United States, Britain, Europe has turned its back on. I think this is typified by the commune movement in decades like the 1960s, especially in the US, where you had one of the largest migrations in history out of the cities and into the rural areas where people would set up their own communes and try and live apart from capitalism, which you just cannot do. It's a complete utopian idea.
Yep.
But that act of literally separating yourself from the rest of the class and thinking that you can find some strange way of becoming immune to the pressures of capital. That is one of the most destructive and stupid ideas that in the history of Western leftism. And as you say, if they can't do that, then they'll form a weird community and try and take it back into the working class again and saying, well, you all now must accept this. Otherwise, you're a bunch of reactionaries. Then they get really offended when people tell them to fuck off. But there you go. So I think I see it as positive that the ACP would be attacked for wanting to actually integrate yourselves with the class and actually re-establish what the old Gramsci term referred to as the organic intellectuals of the working class.
Yep.
So that is the idea that a Communist Party member is a knowledgeable person within his or her community or workplace who understands the situation that the class finds itself in and can explain things in a way, not a dumbed down way, but in a relatable way that the class can understand and rally behind and help to organize itself around. And again, the ruling class understands the risks and dangers of that, which is why they created a left that doesn't do it. They created a left that is fanatically opposed to it. I mean, I believe I saw one of your prominent critics, I think it was a man named Daniel Tutt, say, we have a very nice online community, and this is disturbing it. And I thought that was a brilliant confession, because basically it sums up everything, which is that they have been allowed to have a nice little community talking to each other, not talking to the working class, no threat to the ruling class. And they're allowed to have that because the left in the United States and in Britain is allowed to exist as long as it is clamped on to just the left wing of the bourgeois. It's to modern day versions of what Marx and Engels referred to as bourgeois socialism, basically. You're allowed to be that. And you can make a nice career for yourself doing that, and there'll be no risk of any of them facing state repression or raids from the FBI, because again, you're part of the curated alternative in the West, and that's the only form of socialism or Marxism that's actually allowed to exist. And they're getting very angry because that's now being exposed, because we've been through we are in now the 16th year since the crisis of 2008. There's people who've grown up into adulthood living their entire life in the shadow of this crisis. People turned in your country and mine to reformism in the form of Sanders, in the form of Corbyn. They turned to more openly or avowedly reactionary forces in the form of Donald Trump, or in the form of people like Nigel Farage, all of which were found to be inadequate, all of which were found to be wanting. And slowly, the worker is being compelled to face the reality of his or her conditions of life, which is that if this continues, only immiseration awaits. And you were saying that the American worker knows a lot of this already. So the working class know very well that the political system's a scam. They might not have all the correct theory and understanding as to exactly why it is, but they know it's a scam. That's why only 1 in 5 people actually voted for this government that we've got right now. Record low turnout. It's why there will be almost half the electorate won't vote in a presidential election, going back many, many years. It's why as you said, nobody trusts the institutions. Again, the worker doesn't really know the reasons why a lot of the time, but they understand that it's not for them. And to go back to what you mentioned, Lincoln there, I believe it was in his second inauguration address that he denounced wage labor as the next.
Yeah, it was in one of those. Yeah,
is the next big evil, where he goes on this extended sermon about about doing away with slave labor, and wage labor was almost as offensive. And I thought, Jesus, it's no wonder they shot him.
Labor is prior to and superior to capital. The interests of it. I mean, his administration was in contact with Marx through the First International, and that view that Lincoln had wasn't exclusive to Lincoln. There was people like Frederick Douglass that after the victory over the planter class in the U.S. South said, okay, now that we have seen wage slavery for a few years, it's a monster of its own that has to be conquered.
Yeah, exactly. And this is part of the as well, last time you were on, we were discussing your book about American Marxism, and you argued in there that this is all part of like American traditions. Like this is all there in the traditions of the United States. It's actually there in the traditions of each nation,
Yep,
even
yep.
our own, the oldest imperialist country in the world. You can go and find an alternative tradition, a proletarian tradition that sees the nation in an entirely different way to the domination and control methods of the ruling class. And the other point I wanted to raise was just to go back to the point about the way in which working class politics has been actively suppressed, and that the left is a part of that suppression. Because
Hmm.
when I looked at the response to Trump the first time round, I think now he's pretty much under control, but the first time round, like I thought such a key part of the reason why there was so much hysteria about him was because he did make that appeal to the American worker. Hypocritically, yes. With no chance of ever achieving his program, yes. But even the act of saying the elites suck, I'm on your side,
Hmm.
even that was enough to send like a huge section of the American ruling class and their intellectual flunkies into like a paroxysm of fear,
Hmm.
because suddenly like the working class, even in a distorted way, was being called upon to do something, even by this like scumbag New York property developer billionaire or fake billionaire. And even just that small thing was enough to send them running for the hills in fear. And I mean that's the thing that so many people missed. It's that it's any role for the working class that doesn't involve either complete submission or being reduced to begging for crumbs. Anything that's not that terrifies the bourgeois liberals and their leftist hangers on. And that is, I think, a realization that we must learn from, given that that is something that the leftists have helped perpetuate, basically. Morbid fear of the masses in the United States actually mobilizing in a serious way. What do you say to that interpretation that I've given there about the Trump phenomenon?
No, absolutely. In terms of the left, I developed the concept in the purity fetish, and also in the book from this year, Why We Need American Marxism, that what the left functions here in the US as is as a controlled form of counter hegemony. So
Mm,
it presents itself as counter hegemonic, so against the ruling ideas, but it's actually not. It's actually
mm,
not only neutrally not opposing the hegemonic forces of the state and capital, but it serves an essential role, an essential function for them. What they do is recuperate this or these dissenting attitudes that periodically develop in people and sort of fold them back into a pro-system fold or into organizations that are never going to accomplish anything at all. And it's interesting that you brought up Tut. There was another person as well, Asatar Bear, and we interviewed like 4 years ago at the institute. He got really popular for defending Stalin, and
mm.
he went on a few shows, massive shows, defending Stalin. I think one of them was like Fox News or something. Um, I can't recall, but he came out and said something akin to, "We have a great leftist community, and here comes ACP to tarnish it." And you know what it is? It's like it's Trotskyism with Stalin's face. That's what it
Mm,
is. And that's why it's confused so many people, because in terms of the Trotsky Stalin divide, they claim to be pro Stalin, anti Trotskyite, but in actuality, they're just Trotskyites, which are the compatible left
mm,
par excellence. It's been the left that has been useful for imperialism from the start. And therefore, we can question whether it's even worth being called the left if it sides with the forces of reaction. So that's what I see a whole lot of in the US. And it's a relatively, I think, recent phenomenon here where a lot of people will hold up the right figures. But then in
mm,
actuality, in terms of their real actions on the class struggle unfolding in their own countries, they act like the figures that the figures that they uphold would have, either eliminated or put in a gulag, rightfully so. So,
Yeah. Well, they hold them up and not as living legacies, but as essentially dead images,
yes.
as things which are meant to be thoughtlessly worshipped in a
Hmm.
way that would have disgusted all of the men involved. Let's just be
Yep.
absolutely clear. Just as most of the people who call themselves Luxemburgists would have disgusted Rosa Luxemburg. Like what they a lot of them do is they take the vision of Stalin presented by the bourgeois and say, oh yeah, but that's good, that's based, we like that. Whereas in actual fact, like, you can guarantee that most of them haven't actually studied Stalin's work, which everybody should, because there's a real richness to that. There's a development of Marxism, Leninism in there, which is completely neglected and also largely unavailable except through like specialist communist aligned bookstores. And I find it unsurprising that you can go into a high street bookstore and you can buy Mein Kampf. In fact, they're overflowing with them, and books about Hitler. But the books of Stalin are, I would say, deliberately suppressed. Books of Mao as well.
Unless it's
Even
like
like
Timothy
Lenin.
Snyder or something.
Yeah, this is
Yeah.
Timothy Snyder with Lenin with a 100-page introduction by Timothy Snyder.
Yep.
Which they did try here for a while, but they even stopped publishing like most of Lenin's work. And like, it's deliberate because you go and read Stalin in the debates with Trotsky in the opposition, say in the 1920s, and what you will find there is, well, a lot of things, but two things immediately jump out at you. One is a man who's constantly involved in testing the theory with the practice,
Mhm.
and learning from it and being open about the learning process all the way through the new economic policy, learning from what works and what doesn't, and openly debating that in the Bolshevik or the CPSU as it became. And then actually having the debates out in the open that are published in Pravda with Trotsky, with Zinoviev and the others, and publicly rebuking them basically for getting things wrong, but also saying, and we as a party periodically got things wrong. Our approach to the peasantry needed to change. Our approach to how to solidify the alliance between the urban workers and the peasantry needed to constantly evolve. And once you read that, you discover that the real Stalin is something which is completely different to the dead image held up by the internet fanboys and the
Mhm.
demon presented by the paid academics and the fake historians. But again, like as you say, the Western left its purpose is to not do any of that work, but to reduce everything to dead icons to be screamed over, basically. And you can make a name for yourself being the chief screamer about Stalin, as this guy Asatar Bear was, but actually learning from Stalin, no, forbidden. Can't do that. Actually trying to apply some of the real lessons of when Stalin reflects upon, well, how was the dictatorship of the proletariat actually built and maintained? What went into it? What was its content? Oh, no, you can't learn that. You can't look at that. That's forbidden. Because again, that takes you in the direction of being serious about things.
Mhm.
And I think it's no coincidence that the ACP has been greeted with such hysteria, because the ruling class's actual hegemony in the United States, especially now, and its ideological hegemony over the working class, is visibly shaking away. You've got the ruling class producing joke politicians. You got them producing like garbage culture, which is progressively being rejected by more and more workers. Which is why they employ leftists to scream that if you don't like the latest Marvel products, you must be a racist. Um, but you've got a systemic crisis there, which you, as the ACP, step into the middle of in your foundations, and so it's no coincidence that they deploy the left to attack you, and that the system is growing increasingly repressive and hysterical towards any mild form of dissent, because it just can't handle it anymore. There's no scope for reform. They know that, so any attempt at change has to be repressed, beaten down, terrified into submission. And that's what's going on across all of the imperialist countries now. It's why people get arrested for tweeting about the genocide in occupied Palestine, because they don't intend to change their policy. So their only response is, well, we'll lock people up if they raise too many questions about it. But final point to draw us to the conclusion here, Carlos, which is that the call for the establishment of working class rule is like the core of communism, as I think yourself understand it, and that is something which we try and emphasize here all the time, because socialism to too many workers has come to mean like the failed welfare capitalist projects of the post-war era, and it actually enabled the bourgeois right wingers to steal a march by proclaiming themselves to be in favor of, the radical autonomy of the working class. The worker doesn't want a handout. We'll be the real workers' party, that kind of thing. Trump's still doing it today. But I think that the emphasis that we should put on things is that we don't want to be a layer in society which administers, crumbs to the workers. The working class's historic destiny is to take control of the nation, and to be the class that will truly rule the nation and remake it in its image. And I think that is something which hasn't been talked about even in communist parties for so long. And it's something that I think we should hammer home the point every chance we get. But I wanted to get your thoughts on that before we close out.
And people, I mean, we tend to accept the lexicon with which the ruling class talks about these things, where like people will be more attentive to accepting the things that are most moderate, right? That's the general assumptions that people operate with. But is it true? Is it true? And I remember this this experience that I had when I was organizing with the Bernie Sanders campaign, and at that point I identified as a Marxist Leninist. And I would talk to people, especially the people from working class backgrounds or farmers. They weren't very receptive to Bernie Sanders because for them it felt like handouts, right? Just having the state do more for me. But when I started scrapping the Bernie campaign narrative and just going, full communist mode, and talking about, no, it's about power. Like, are you going to continue letting the boss fuck you, or are you going to own up to your historic destiny and control the things that you already work in? And when you start speaking in those terms, in terms of socialism as not more taxes that the rich pay to fund social programs or whatever, but who is going to control society? Is it going to be you, working class people, or is it going to be the parasites that are controlling it now? That narrative is much easier to accept for working class people than that traditional social democratic bunk that they do genuinely, at least in the US, they interpret it as handouts. And not to say that having social welfare programs are wrong. Socialist countries have good welfare programs, but the welfare, how it functions in the US, it's that the vast majority of the working class has to participate in it because they can't survive because they're not paid enough. So the state has to supplement them. But where do those funds come from? They come from working class people who pay the taxes to half go to war and half pay for what the capitalists didn't pay in wages. And how now become a responsibility of the state to account for the inability that people have to survive. So, I mean, it's not, I don't like the language of handouts, but there is something to the fact that it is the state through the taxes of the people that are paying for some of these things because the capitalists didn't pay them enough because of other factors, inflation, etc. But, you mentioned, the role of leftists. And we had an incident recently. I wonder if you saw it, but one of our comrades in Carbondale, which is where I lived for like 5 years, that's where I did my master's and PhD. One of our comrades in Carbondale, Emery, along with the other comrades in Carbondale, had been distributing for months medical supplies for this outbreak of Lyme disease that existed in Carbondale. It's a place where most of what there is to do is hike, and the hiking areas are filled with ticks. So they were
Mm.
distributing these things, doing community service, cleaning up communities, and doing amazing work. Well, this comrade Emery gets approached a week and a half ago by a 6'6" trans individual named Cassandra at a Casey's gas station, who starts to harass him and takes him outside and records him and calls him a fascist and says that the ACP hat that he was wearing was the equivalent of a Nazi swastika. Okay, and then Cassandra's partner, and the weirdest voice I've ever heard on a Cassandra, very deep voice. Cassandra's partner goes ahead on Facebook and mentions in the comments that we should be killed or something like that. So, Alex, let me ask you a question. What group historically, in the periods of crisis of capital, were the ones that through extra legal means approached the communists and terrorized them or threatened to terrorize them, as some of the leftists are doing to us? It's been the fascists. The fascists have been the henchmen of finance capital throughout their whole lives. That's what fascism is par excellence. And that's the role that the left, in part, especially the most extreme woke parts of it, plays in the US.
Well, there wasn't a joke when Stalin said that social democracy is objectively the moderate wing of fascism, but it
Yep.
doesn't sound like Cassandra or whatever his real name is really should probably read that and took it to heart and said yes, we are. But there's a serious point, a very serious point in what you get, in what happened to your comrades there, and also like the role of social democracy, which is that it is a real distinction between communism and social democracy that goes back a long way, probably to the days of, well, arguably to the days of the 1840s, from the writing of the manifesto itself, but certainly since the split in the Second International, that you have the communists who are, as we've been discussing, whose center of activity, whose driving purpose is to overcome this system, to have our class become the ruling class, to start the process, start that long struggle towards a classless society in maybe the far future, in several generations away. And that is a fundamentally different vision to that which is held by the social democrat. The social democrat, even on the left, even the left versions of the social democrat, sees the working class as, at best, something that they push onto the stage periodically and then are pushed off the stage again. And the social democrat, the bureaucrat, the technocrat get down to the business of bargaining with the employers. That's what social democracy really is. And in Britain, we're probably the absolute masters of it, because our Labour Party was never even pretended to be Marxist. It was always that coalition of petty bourgeois intellectuals and trade union bureaucrats coming together to, what, as they saw it, do a decent thing every now and again for the working class. And it is those people who, in the 20s and 30s, were objectively speaking siding with fascism. And as the decade wore on, in the 30s, started to more and more openly side with fascism. Like, there's plenty of examples of social democrats just going straight over to the Nazis. People who'd been active in the social democracy going straight over to National Socialism, because it really wasn't all that much different, but a difference by that stage. In the foundation of the people's democracies, like places like Hungary and Poland, many social democrats, of course, joined the process of building the people's democracies. The leaders, though, largely sided with capital, sided with the people like the Horthyites in Hungary, and tried frantically to derail the process of the building of the people's democracies and the people's anti-fascist government that were brought in, or that came in after the war. And a lot of them ended up living in exile in Britain or the United States, collaborating with imperialism and being in alliance with fascism. And that's not an accident. And so for some lunatic to decide that he's going to go and threaten to kill somebody for, doing actual community service and actually daring to try to get back to what communism should be in both theory and practice, actually isn't a surprise. And
Yep.
if you look at the very long history of these, let's just say, unstable individuals in all countries, but especially the imperialist centers, being recruited by various different police agencies as informants, as double agents, and as assets, again, not a surprise. The established left is riddled with these people. The state promotes them in various different ways. They make sure that if we're talking the online world, that they get big platforms and that they get a big audience because the algorithm pushes people towards them. That's what BreadTube was.
There's
It's what
people who I've never seen one video. I've never seen Majority Report in my life. It's in the suggested videos to watch all the fucking
yeah.
time. I don't get it. But you're absolutely, I mean, even look at the foundations of fascism as something
Hmm.
explicitly sort of self-conscious of itself as fascism and Mussolini.
Hmm.
Where does he come out of? These same social democratic spaces. And the role that fascism plays as a form of governance that can attempt to manage the contradictions of capitalism and crisis,
Hmm.
in a way, as the Stalinist position upholds, that's the same thing the Social Democrats try to do in a perhaps different form, but it's absolutely the same thing. They're the ones that try to manage the contradictions that make themselves heightened in those periods of crisis. And it's very visible right now in the US because our biggest haters are coming from two directions: the leftists that are threatening to kill us, a lot of them. It wasn't just the Cassandra individual, a whole lot of them. There was one a while back that put a picture of a scope, and within the scope, it was like the infrared logo, the Midwestern Marx logo, and the ACP. Um, and this was an individual with like 14,000 subscribers on Twitch or something.
Hmm.
The leftists and the other group, which is now being promoted by X, are the Groypers, the literal like Nazi and racist like Nick Fuentes.
Oh yeah.
And these groups are starting to organize themselves. They have gone out and doxed quite a few of our members and party leaderships and their families and partners. And we have taken them head on, while the leftists have said, no, we don't even want to debate with them. Let them continue to reach disaffected young men. We have taken them head on. And because we take them head on, the leftists call us fascist. The self-proclaimed fascists call us Jewish or brown or whatever stupid thing they call us. And I think that, that's the good Stalinist, Marxist, Leninist golden center. When you're getting attacked by all the right people, I think you might be doing something right.
Well, yes, and exactly, and it's no surprise that the ruling class will be, in the United States would be now actively pushing disaffected, pissed off younger guys in particular towards open fascism because there's some in the ruling class who have already reached the conclusion that that's the only way they're going to be able to save themselves. So get those guys ready, whether it's a clown like Nick Fuentes or somebody else, or probably somebody a bit more serious in the end. But they want them there as the reserve force if they need them, because they know that there are big class struggles to come in the United States, because the crisis of 2008 never ended. It is only getting worse. And the crisis for all of the imperialist countries is going to renew itself, especially when I think if two things happen in the next year, which probably I think it's a fair bet will occur. One, the final defeat of the NATO operation in Ukraine, which is coming. And two, whatever outcome does emerge, which will not be favorable to Israel in West Asia, that will be devastating for US imperialism, British imperialism, French imperialism in that region. It will end the 100 years of domination over those peoples that began after the implosion of the Ottoman Empire. And that will be a huge blow to the US ruling class in particular and to the British. And that will push them into a massive crisis. And so it is, I think, a very positive thing that the American Communist Party is out there establishing yourselves now with, I think, the right attitude in terms of going into the masses, being amongst them, and establishing the party as a trusted voice and a trusted face in those communities. And the state's aware of that, and therefore you're attracting the right enemies as a result, as the state starts throwing things at you to try and essentially knock the party off its stride as early as possible. So I think it's a crucial time to be a communist anywhere in the world, but I think especially in this period of great change when the imperialist powers that have defined the last 3 centuries are finding that it's all coming to a close. We don't know where the struggle's going to go, but I feel at least there are enough of us now to start to push it in the right direction. But I'll leave the final word in the discussion to yourself, comrade.
No, I couldn't agree more with everything you said. And the repression is coming from all angles, from the state itself. I mean, our people can't leave the country without getting harassed when they come back by customs, their phones copied, interrogated for 2, 3, 4 hours. Um, we've had members receive documents from, states inquiring as to their activities with the ACP. And the repression is ramping up, and
Mm.
it is, and there's a lot of stuff that can't be said on air. But it's the only thing that I'm really glad about is that the leadership of the party and what I saw in the eyes of the membership, the cadre at our national convention, is that these are people that are serious about what's being done here, what's being built. They're not doing it as a social club for fun to elevate their status and prestige. These are people that are willing to give their lives to the struggle. And that's the sort of character I think we need, because you're not going to beat an imperialist, parasitic monster machine like the US capitalist system without an attitude that is ready to put everything on the line for the advancement of the class struggle. And, one of the things that also sets us apart from other leftist organizations is that we emphasize character. We need to
Mm.
have some sort of a communist virtue ethic. We need to be honorable people. We need to be courageous. That's something that Aristotle used to say: you can have every virtue, but if you don't have courage, you're all meaningless. When has the left talked about courage? Having Sinwar-like courage. I mean,
Mm.
that's what communists need. That's what communists are known for historically. So I know the party's ready for anything that comes towards us to adjust and keep moving forward, irrespective of how hard hits we get. But as far as plugging anything, I'm currently opening up the signups to a class on Marxism Leninism. It's a 16-week seminar. People can now sign up for the first 8 weeks. It's the low, affordable Midwestern Marx Institute prices that we usually put out, and people get the recording. So if you're in Britain and the time difference makes it so that you can't be there for too long, you could still watch the recording and keep it, for eternity. I also just recently published a book this year called Why We Need American Marxism, that develops on some of the themes of the last time we spoke, the book that we spoke about, which was the purity fetish, and that thinks about what would the unique adaptation of Marxism-Leninism to an American context look like, in a way almost homologous to like citified Marxism-Leninism in China or something like that. So you can check all of that out at the Midwestern Marx website at midwesternmarx.com. And as far as signing up for the class, we're going to pin it to our Twitter, which is just Midwestern Marx. I haven't pinned it. By the time you watch the interview, it will be pinned to the Twitter, so you can check that out there. But thank you so much for having me on, Alex. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I've really enjoyed this opportunity.
Always an interesting discussion, Carlos. Thank you for coming on today. And that was the last hour. We've been talking to Carlos Garrido of the American Communist Party and Midwestern Marx. Be sure to check out all the details he mentioned just there. And it only remains for me to say good luck in the struggles to come, comrade. I think we'll both need it.
Yes, likewise. Thank you.
All right.